of the 17th Congress is hereby called to order. Our Majority Leader, Senator Soto, will lead the chamber in prayer.
From the Holy Book, Proverbs 3, verses 13 to 18. Blessed are those who find wisdom, those who gain understanding. For she is more profitable than silver, and yields better returns than gold. She is more precious than rubies. Nothing you desire can compare with her. Long life is in her right hand. In her left hand are riches and honor. Her ways are pleasant ways, and all her paths are peace. She is a tree of life to those who take hold of her. Those who hold her fast will be blessed. Heavenly Father, you said that if we are to ask for wisdom, you will give it generously. Today, Lord, I humbly ask that your wisdom be poured out over each and every person in this country. Guide us in everything we do and in every action and decision we make, both big and small. Lord, give us understanding and insights into people and situations we would not have gleaned without your divine intercession, and give us clear leadings into actions you would like us to take. Teach us to value godly wisdom, honor, and the fear of the Lord above all things, so that your good, pleasing, and perfect will come to pass over our land. Let the fruits of your wisdom, including your peace, prosperity, and long life, be felt by all your people. And Lord, I pray that your favor and mercy be upon each and every one of us, and let your glory be evident for all to see. In Jesus' mighty name we pray. Amen.
Amen. Thank you, Senator Soto. Secretary, please call the roll.
Roll call of members. The Honorable Senators Angara, Aquino, Binay, Cayetano, De Lima, Drilon, Ejercito, Escudero, Gatchalian, Gordon, Honasan, Ontiveros, Lacson, Ligarda, Pacquiao, Pangilinan, Po, Recto, Soto, Trillanes, Villanueva, Villar, Zuberi, and Senate President Pimentel.
With 19 senators present, the chair declares the presence of a quorum.
Mr. President, I will still have to move to defer the approval of the journal of the 41st session, Monday, November 28, 2016, as it is still being finalized pretty much like the 40th session, Mr. President. So I move that we defer.
Is there any objection to the motion? There being none, motion is approved.
Mr. President, I move that we proceed with the reference of business.
Any objection? There being none, the motion is approved. Secretary, let's do the reference of business.
Bills on first reading. 1253, an act institutionalizing the Electric Cooperatives Disaster Management Fund and providing funds therefore. Introduced by Senator Win Gatchalian.
Referred to the Committees on Energy, Cooperatives, Ways and Means, and Finance.
1254, an act to eliminate all forms of sexual harassment in workplaces, educational institutions, and public places, and providing penalties therefore. Repealing for the purpose Republic Act Number 7877, otherwise known as the Anti-Sexual Harassment Act of 1995, by Senator Grace Poe.
Senator Drilon, that's a pleasure.
May we have only one session, and the other session should be adjourned.
Can we request for silence, please? Not only from the plenary, but also from the floor. Thank you very much. Sante Secretary, you have already read Senate Bill number 1254.
54.
Okay, referred to the Committees on Labor, Employment and Human Resources Development, and Civil Service, Government Reorganization, and Professional Regulation.
Resolution number 234, resolution directing the appropriate Senate committee to conduct an investigation in aid of legislation as to the failure of the Power Sector Assets and Liabilities Management Corporation to remit dividends due to the national government. Senator Win Gatchalian.
To the Committee on Energy.
Committee report number 12, prepared and submitted by the Committee on Public Information and Mass Media on Senate Bill number 1255, with Senator Soto III and Trillanes IV as authors thereof, entitled An Act Expanding the Coverage of Exemptions from Revealing the Source of Public News or Information Obtained in Confidence by including journalists from broadcast, news agencies, and internet publications, amending for the purpose Section 1 of Republic Act number 53 as amended by Republic Act 1477, recommending its approval in substitution of Senate Bill numbers 6 and 486. Senator Grace Poe.
To the calendar for ordinary business.
Mr. President, we'd like to
Majority Leader.
welcome a guest in the Senate, Mr. Edward Falayang, the lightweight world champion of the MMA. Won championship defending honor in Singapore, indoor, with the coach Mark Sanglao, Mr. President.
So this is MMA, not boxing.
Yes.
So welcome to the world champion.
Thank you. Mr. President, with the permission of the body, I move to transfer from the calendar for ordinary business to the calendar for special orders, PS Resolution 241 under Committee Report number 11.
There is a motion to transfer PS Resolution number 241 under Committee Report number 11 from the calendar of ordinary business to the calendar for special orders. Any objection? There being none, the motion is approved.
With the permission of the body, I move to consider PS Resolution 241 under Committee Report number 11.
Any objection? There being none, motion is approved.
May we ask the Secretary to read the title of the measure?
Resolution concurring in the ratification of the Articles of Agreement of the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank.
Majority Leader.
Mr. President, to sponsor the measure, may we ask the Vice Chairman of the Committee on Foreign Relations, Senator Loren Legarda, be recognized.
Senator Legarda is recognized to sponsor the measure under consideration.
Jutay lang.
Ma'am, you need... Senator Legarda has been recognized.
Mr. President, distinguished colleagues, I have the honor to seek approval of proposed Senate Resolution number 241, titled Resolution Concurring in the Ratification of the Articles of Agreement of the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, prepared and submitted by the Committee on Foreign Relations on November 22, 2016, per its Committee Report number 11. Asia faces a massive infrastructure deficit. The daily traffic crawl in Metro Manila and scenes of passengers walking along MRT tracks are reflective of the very tragic state of infrastructure development in our country. We are not alone. In Southeast Asia, more than a third of the population live in substandard housing. In many countries of Asia, the biggest cost is their supply chain. The movement of goods inside many Asian countries is so unreliable that there is no way of saying when the supply will actually arrive. In times of disasters, the infrastructure challenges translate to losses in human lives. We are in this situation for a range of reasons, from bureaucratic inefficiencies, changing geographic distribution of people, weak regulatory environments, growth dynamics, to name a few. Financing is another issue. Infrastructure programs compete for finite funds with other national priorities. The Asian Development Bank estimates that Asia will need at least 8.29 trillion US dollars to finance infrastructure between 2010 and 2020 in order to maintain current levels of economic growth. These estimates do not even include social infrastructure requirements and infrastructure spending for disaster reconstruction efforts, which has become an annual requirement for us. Infrastructure funding requirements of Asia are expected to grow by 7% to 8% every year, reaching $5.36 trillion annually by 2025, representing nearly 60% of the world's total. Globally, there is a gap of $500 billion annually between investment needs and the available public funds. Asia, where 1.75 billion people live in extreme poverty, requires substantial amount of funding for infrastructure to make inclusive growth possible across economies. The Philippines ranked 95 out of 138 economies in the 2016-2017 World Economic Forum's Global Competitiveness Index on Infrastructure, highlighting how much we have lagged behind other economies. The absence of good infrastructure, from road networks, transportation systems, airports and seaports, electrification, water supply, telecommunications, they've all had dire consequences on our nation's growth, above all, on our people's well-being. The World Bank estimates that a 10% increase in capital investment into infrastructure projects contributes to a 1% growth in GDP. Development of infrastructure is also crucial for enhancing our trade competitiveness. Resilient and adequate infrastructure will reduce the cost of trade and strengthen our competitiveness. These would impact on our future growth. The AIIB, like the Asian Development Bank and the World Bank, is a multilateral lending institution owned by sovereign member countries which aims to promote economic development in Asia. It aims to foster economic development and to promote regional cooperation. The Philippines is the 57th prospective founding member of the AIIB, the last to have signed in December last year. 48 have already attained full membership, including Australia, France, Germany, India, South Korea, and Russia. All ASEAN countries have signed on, with the Philippines and Malaysia as the only ASEAN countries that have yet to deposit their instrument of ratification. We have only until December 31 of this year to make this submission and to pay our initial capital contribution. An AIIB membership brings a host of benefits, including additional source of financing to implement better and resilient infrastructure, both by government and the private sector, to accelerate the Philippines' annual infrastructure spending to account for 5% of GDP or even higher, and improving competitiveness through better infrastructure facilities that will attract investments into the country, to provide additional funding source to support rural and value chain development, to increase agricultural and rural enterprise productivity and rural tourism of the country. AIIB offers concessional rates that are comparable to the rates of the World Bank and the ADB, better than many of the Philippines' bilateral partners' lending rate, and lower than the Philippines' commercial borrowing rates. The AIIB can provide an annual financing window to the Philippines of about $200 million to $500 million. In the end, we can see a 400% to 1,150% return on investment of our required paid-in capital of $196 million in 5 years. Under the AIIB's lending policy, the private sector can likewise avail of services or products from AIIB such as guarantees, private equity investments, and co-financing with private banks. AIIB aims to supplement and not crowd out private sector financing, since it will focus on vital financing projects that are unable to avail of reasonable financing terms and conditions. The Philippines is expected to also realize other benefits from its membership in the AIIB: increased opportunities for Filipino contractors, professionals for infrastructure projects in the Philippines and abroad, more employment opportunities for Filipino workers due to heightened infrastructure spending, reduced trade costs of about 15.6% of a trade value and real income gain of about $220 billion, increased competitiveness and productivity, improved market connectivity, and enhanced economic opportunities for both urban and rural areas of the country. All these, Mr. President, will contribute to the achievement of President Rodrigo Duterte's 10-point socio-economic development agenda. The AIIB adheres to sound banking principles in its operations, consistent with principles of transparency, openness, independence, and accountability. It is also guided by environmental and social sustainability safeguards, similar to what the World Bank and the ADB have established. Infrastructure bottlenecks have stifled their growth for many years. More investment is required, not only to build new projects, but also to maintain existing infrastructure. The AIIB can broaden our infrastructure funding sources. Let me underscore, however, that financing alone will not solve all our problems. The fundamental issues have to be set right. We need to simultaneously create an environment with a predictable legal and regulatory framework, buttressed by transparent governance and decision-making processes. Let us take, however, this crucial step to help address one of the most pressing issues facing our infrastructure sector. I therefore recommend and urge our dear colleagues to approve proposed Senate Resolution 241 concurring in the ratification of the Articles of Agreement on the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank. Thank you, Mr. President.
Thank you, Senator Ligarda. Majority Leader,
Mr. President, I move to open the period of interpellation.
any objection? There being none, the period of interpellation is hereby opened.
We have reservations to interpellate, Mr. President, the President Pro Tem, Senator Drilon, and then Senator Risa Ontiveros.
Senator Drilon is recognized.
Just give me the cue cards. Okay.
Thank you, Mr. President. Thank you, Mr. Majority Leader. Will the Honorable Chair of our Committee on Finance and sponsor of the measure, Senator Ligarda, yield a few questions?
Yes, of course, to our Senate President Pro Tempore. Just for the record, this is a Committee on Foreign Relations request of Senator Alan Cayetano. Yes, so I'm trying to fill in that.
We understand that,
Yes.
Mr. President. Mr. President, for the record, we are supporting the concurrence of the Senate to the ratification of the AIIB. Mr. President, just a few matters that we want to spread into the record. How many founding members would AIIB have? In other words, how many have signed the Articles of Agreement?
Mr. President, there are 57 founding members.
Okay. And is the Philippines one of the 50?
Yes, Mr. President, we are one of the 57.
Did we sign it as the 57th member?
Yes, Mr. President.
All right. Now, so, and this was signed when, for the record?
In December, during the Aquino administration, 1 year ago, Mr. President.
December
of 2015.
December 31 of 2015, to be more precise.
Yes, Mr. President.
All right. Now, and it was again ratified by the present President, the Senator.
Yes,
President
Mr. President.
Duterte. When was this?
I'm looking for the exact date. It was in the month of October that it was ratified and transmitted. In October 16, Mr. President.
So on October 15,
Let me correct myself, October 19, 2016.
on October 19, 2016,
16, this year, Mr. President, yes.
this year, President Duterte again concurred,
Ratified it,
for the
yes.
second time. Now, for the record, the total capitalization is 100 billion US dollars of the for this AIIB.
The authorized capital is 100 billion US dollars, Mr.
That's
President.
correct. And what is the required paid-in capital?
The indicative paid-in capital is 196 million US dollars for the Philippines allocation or Philippines capital allocation, Mr. President.
Can we have that again, sir?
The Philippines capital allocation, Mr. President, is 196 million US dollars, but payable in 5 years.
$196 million. That's firstly, our capital share for the record is about 1% of the total AIIB shares.
Yes, Mr. President.
And,
It's actually, to be exact, is 0.9975%.
All right.
So 1%.
All right. Now, which requires us to subscribe to approximately $196 million worth of capital shares.
Yes, Mr. President, paid in.
Yes. This is payable in how many installments?
4 years, well, including this year, 1, 2, 3, 4. 4 years, Mr. President.
4 years. And how much per installment are we required to
For
pay?
2016, $39 million or 1.86 billion. For 2017, $78 million or 3.72 billion. For 2018, $39 million, 1.86 billion. And 39 million or 1.86 for 2019.
And the first installment is due when, Mr. President?
Before the end of the year, Mr. President, of this year.
We are supposed to remit 1,960,000,000 pesos to the AIIB before the end of 2016.
Before the end of the year. Yes, Mr.
Is that
President.
correct? Now, so the next question, obvious question is this in the current General Appropriations Act?
Use of savings. Use of savings.
Okay. For the required paid-in capital of the 1.86 billion this year, the DOF through DBM has requested the use of savings to augment the Bureau of Treasury's budget allocated for cash management, funding, and investment of excess funds.
Can we? So it will be sourced from savings.
It is the use of savings to augment the BOT's allocation for, this is the heading, cash management, funding, and investment of excess funds.
That is the item which will be augmented.
Yes, under the Bureau of Treasury.
And how much is the present allocation for that particular item which will be augmented?
How much is the present allocation in the Bureau of Treasury? I-augment lang yun, no? It's a present line item. Can you check? The exact figure of the, they're checking now, the line, it's a line item provision in the 2016 budget, and there's still a pending request for the approval of the President. They're checking the exact amount, but itong 1.5 billion
Did you have budget?
That's the sources
The savings.
of this, these two.
Yes, ma'am.
But this is two for the 1.86,
Yes,
right?
yes.
Yeah, yeah. I'm not able to answer that. They're asking or finding out the exact amount that is for that line item in the 2016 budget in the Bureau of Treasury.
So, for the record, this item was created really for the purpose of paying subscription
is this?
obligations
Cash
to
management fund.
international financial agencies?
Yes, ma'am. That's useful for payment.
Yes, Mr. President. It's really, this line item is meant for memberships and commitments for our international obligations.
All right. And where will the savings come from, which will be used to augment
Dalawa.
this particular item?
Mr. President, 1.5 billion from the discontinuance of the new DOF building in 2016, and 0.36 billion will be charged against the 2016 President's Contingent Fund.
Okay, the contingent fund is how much again? 0.3
0.3
billion. And the remaining balance of...
That's 360 million.
360 billion. The remaining balance of roughly 1.6 billion would be coming from where?
From the DOF building, the discontinuance of the DOF building, there's 1.5 billion sourced from that.
All right. So there is a DOF building which will no longer be built and will be the source of the savings.
Yes, Mr. President.
We are asking these questions because in the recent debate on the budget, there was a lot of discussion about the utilization of savings. Okay, just on one more item and one more subject. We are here today to give our consent to the and concurrence to the ratification done by the President, which requires, under the Constitution, 2/3 of the members of the Senate.
Sorry, naano ko. I'm sorry, could you repeat because I was trying to...
Yes. The present, the resolution on the floor of the committee report will precisely secure the concurrence of 2/3 of the members of the Senate.
Yes, Mr. President.
For this treaty or
16.
this instrument to be effective and binding. Is that correct?
Yes.
Okay. Now, what is the process of withdrawal from this instrument?
We can withdraw. Okay. Yeah, just give me that. Yes, I am told that we can withdraw and retrieve our allocation, but let me just, yes.
Is
Yes,
there
Mr.
anything
President.
in the, how would you call it, the treaty?
Yes.
That would
Yes.
specify the process of withdrawal?
Yes,
and
Mr.
what is it?
President.
Yes.
Yeah, it is indicated in the treaty, the Philippines can withdraw membership, and in case of the withdrawal of membership, the bank shall arrange for the repurchase of the country's shares at the repurchase price shown at the value of the books of the bank at the date of the country when the country ceases to be a member. However, the bank may withhold a certain amount so long as a country is a borrower or guarantor or a contracting party with respect to equity investment or other financing with the bank. But that's provided in the treaty.
Can the good sponsor point to us which particular provision is this, to save time, sir?
Can you point what part of the treaty?
Sana. Yeah. Can the good sponsor?
Yes, we are.
Yeah.
They're just looking at the page where it's indicated.
please.
It's here, Mr. President. It's on Article 37 for withdrawal and 38 for suspension and 39 for settlement of accounts. On Chapter 7, page 22.
Yes, that's Article 37 of the agreement. Now, for this agreement to be binding on the government, the concurrence of the Senate must be secured. Is that a correct premise,
You are
Mr.
correct,
President?
Mr. President.
Now, the withdrawal as read out by the good sponsor on Article 37, who is authorized to withdraw our membership from the bank.
The president, the governor.
The governor who will be elected, appointed. It will be the governor who will be appointed by the president, who will represent the Philippines in the board of the bank.
I'm sorry to disagree on that opinion. When we concur in the treaty, this becomes part of the law of the land. When we withdraw from the treaty, it cannot just be the governor who will withdraw from the treaty.
Mr. President, I am told that the governor who is appointed by the president is the representative of the country in the board. But of course, the governor will have to consult with the executive department that ratified it and with the Philippine Senate that concurred in the ratification. But if you're asking me whether there will be a need to return to the Senate for a rescinding of the agreement, that we're not certain because just 1 minute suspension.
1 minute suspension, yes, Mr. President.
Well, a minute
Has this
suspension.
ever happened when we? How do you rescind?
Check yung, kasi
There's no precedent.
a member may withdraw. But
But it doesn't say. Yeah, but it does not state. But it's silent on that. Pero yung proseso. So we can put on record that because we. that- But because we are the ratifying body, in concurring, the governor has to deal with BFA. Ready to resume, Mr. President. Basta ganun na lang, gawin yung internal. So, hindi parang ang rubber stamp kasi kinuncur. Tapos pag ayaw ninyo, hindi namin alam. Hindi. Kami rin ang mag-ano. Saan ba DFA dito? Dapat dito po kayo. DFA. Sarap pa din yan. You answer me. No. Stay here, buddy. Please stay here. No, because there's no precedent for withdrew. No, because any treaty goes to the Senate for concurrence. Is there anything in our history where we withdrew unilaterally without Senate approval? No, because you cannot. Because we concur, we have to be told, right? Okay lang. Sige. Ready to resume?
record, and we will.
Pakitawagan nga Malacanang, kailan pa-transmit ang Paris Agreement? Gusto ko, bago mapasa ang budget, i-transmit muna nila ang Paris Agreement. Yan ang pinto ko. At ang BFA naman, gawin ang trabaho na nila, mangulit dun sa Malacanang. Huwag nila ako bulahin dahil naka-concur na lahat. Oo. Mic up na ako sa, ganyan na. Ganyan. I-transmit nila bago pa yung sa budget. Tawagan mo, sinabi ko yun.
Okay.
Tapos ako ang kanilang 2.5 billion quintal, ha? Sa opening, ha? Oh, yun. So, I want to ratify the Paris Agreement before we adjourn on the 15th. So, pasa ng budget,
Ito lang.
concur.
Certified ba? Can you certify? Hindi ko bili. This is a
Now, walang session bukas, transmitted during the week para Monday pwede mag-sponsor. Tapos, Monday, may 6 days na session day. Bago mag-Christmas break, concurred ang Paris Agreement, pasa ang budget, ang ganda. Patay. Diba? Ang ganda niyan. Oh, may AIIB ka, may Paris.
although baka hindi naman umabot doon.
Ready to resume, Mr. President.
Session is resumed.
Mr. President, we had a pending question with the sponsor, and during the break, the sponsor and this representation agreed that the sponsor will spread into the record the interpretations and the answer to our query. So,
Yes, Mr. President. The Senate President pro tempore is correct that the ratification in the agreement needs the concurrence of the Senate, and therefore any withdrawal from the agreement concurring in this treaty of our being a founding member of the AAIB will have to go to the Senate as well, meaning the governor appointed by the President representing the country will have to seek the approval of the Office of the President in coordination with the Department of Foreign Affairs, and will have to seek the concurrence of the Philippine Senate that ratified or concurred in the ratification of the agreement.
I fully agree with the learned view of the sponsor because the Constitution really prefers a shared decision-making insofar as treaties are concerned. As we are all aware, and for the record, Mr. President, under Section 21, Article 7 of our Constitution, quote, no treaty or international agreement shall be valid and effective unless concurred in by at least two-thirds of all the members of the Senate, close quote. Since our Constitution requires Senate concurrence for the validity and effectivity of treaties, the Senate concurrence should likewise be required to terminate them as opined by the good sponsor, Senator Ligarda.
I fully agree, Mr. President. with our most learned colleague.
Mr. President, therefore, we move, we will move at the appropriate time that our resolution of concurrence should include that particular paragraph.
We wholeheartedly agree, Mr. President.
With that, Mr. President, we are fully satisfied with the answers placed on the record, and we therefore terminate our interpretation on this particular agreement.
I thank you, Mr. President, for your most valuable contribution in this concurrence of the resolution.
Majority Leader.
May we now recognize Senator Hontiveros.
Senator Tiberos is recognized for interpellation.
Thank you, Mr. President. Would the good sponsor yield to some questions?
Yes, Mr. President.
Thank you, Madam Sponsor. Throughout the entire Articles of Agreement, environmental and social safeguards are mentioned only once. In Article 13, Operating Principles, specifically Article 13.4. There's no mention of how policies addressing environmental and social impacts will be developed, and the possible space for civil society to be a part of that process. Point 9 on development partner policies could put a very low safeguard standard in place, generating significant environmental, social, fiduciary, and reputational risks. Because it indicates that the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank may apply a co-financier's environmental and social policies and may rely on the co-financier's determination as to whether compliance with their policies and procedures has been achieved. So, good sponsor, the mitigation measures in the required Environment and Social Management Plan, or ESMP, do not clearly indicate a binding requirement on the client in case of non-compliance. The absence of a minimum 120-day public commenting period, as required by other international financial institutions like the World Bank, the ADB, which the AIIB seeks to be an alternative to. The absence of this minimum 120-day public commenting period means that potentially impacted communities would be denied the ability to respond to and provide detailed input on assessments done by others of likely risks and impacts to their lives and livelihoods. And from the AOA, Articles of Agreement, there's no indication towards sustainable development or poverty alleviation in its agenda. So for my first question, good sponsor, what are the legally binding requirements within the ESF, or Environmental and Social Framework,
Yes.
which ensure that both the bank and the client implement and adhere to this ESF?
Thank you, Mr. President. First of all, thank you for bringing that up, because as you know, I would make sure that the issue of environment
Exactly.
is taken up and included in the agreement. Very clear, Mr. President, that the bank recognizes that environmental and social sustainability is a fundamental aspect of achieving its outcomes. And this is like the general framework, but there will be implementing rules based on this AIIB environmental and social protection mechanisms. And the bank follows three aspects, three associated environmental standards, which set out more detailed mandatory environmental and social requirements, such as environmental and social assessment management. The bank requires its clients to undertake environmental and social assessments in varying degrees depending on the categorization of the project. The assessment considers project and design alternatives to avoid or minimize physical and/or economic displacement and the impact on indigenous peoples. There's also the ESS2 involuntary resettlement. Bank screens projects whether or not it involves involuntary resettlement. When it is not feasible to avoid involuntary resettlement, it is required to ensure that resettlement activities are conceived and executed sustainable development programs, ensuring that persons displaced by the project will share in the project's benefits. And there's ESS 3 on indigenous peoples. In screening projects, excuse me, the bank seeks the technical judgment of experts and scientists with expertise on the social and cultural groups in the project area. The bank also conducts consultations with indigenous peoples and requires the client to prepare indigenous peoples' plan if the project will greatly impact indigenous peoples. This is similar to the World Bank and to the standards of the ADB.
Thank you, Madam Sponsor. Actually, Madam Sponsor's response leads me to two of my other questions, which I'll treat as follow-up questions then. So first on forced eviction. Footnote 13 of the AOA calls for involuntary resettlement with the, quote, avoidance of the use of unnecessary, disproportionate, or excessive force. This is not, Madam Sponsor, this is not an outright ban on the use of violence to obtain land for an AIIB project. And this vague standard appears instead to allow the quote-unquote necessary use of force for possible land grabbing. Thus, the vague use of terminology has made allowance for the use of violence against local communities. Therefore, Madam Sponsor, in its present formulation,
Yes.
this is completely unacceptable. And I respectfully wait to hear Madam Sponsor's
May I just know,
comment on
Mr.
this.
President, thank you for that, if the good lady senator is referring to the treaty itself, or are these the guidelines?
This is footnote 13. Treaty proper or guideline? Madam Sponsor, footnote 13 in the guidelines.
Footnote 13 in the guidelines. Can I see? Is it there?
13 is different. This one is different. What we have right is traffic and all.
Are you referring to, just so that we're on, literally on the same page?
Yes, Madam
We're
Sponsor.
looking at the environmental and social standards on page 21.
I think it's for footnote 19. She was referring to for
Can you show me footnote 19?
I'm tracing the exact page, Madam Sponsor, but this is the one, footnote 13 is the one with the direct quote, avoidance of the use of unnecessary, disproportionate, or excessive force in the guidelines.
Yes. Forced eviction, that's what you read,
Yes, Madam Sponsor.
is defined as a permanent or temporary removal against the will of individuals, families, and communities from homes without the provision of or access forms of legal. So your concern is
My concern,
The
Madam
issue
Sponsor,
of
is the issue of the use
possible
of
use of
force.
violence.
Yes, Madam Sponsor.
but there's an exclusion. We couldn't refer to an exclusion.
there is a
Exclusion.
provision on exclusion, Mr. President, which says that the bank does not finance projects that it determines do not comply with the ESP and the ESS. The bank does not knowingly finance a project that either involves or results in forced evictions or involves activities or items specified in the list set forth in the attached environmental social exclusion list.
Thank you, Madam Sponsor. That also leads to another of my questions on the exclusion list. The AIIB exclusion list fails to have clear and unambiguous prohibitions. In the case of AIIB, it states, quote, AIIB does not knowingly finance operations involving the following. In sharp contrast, Madam Sponsor, to the other multilateral development banks, AIIB exclusion list, makes no prohibition on support for example, quote, production of or trade in radioactive materials, including nuclear reactors and components thereof, or quote, production or activities involving harmful or exploitative forms of forced labor or child labor. Similarly, financing projects in conflict zones must be included in the AIIB exclusion list. So, Madam Sponsor, my abiding concern is that there is no clear and unambiguous prohibition on force or violence, and not also, no also yet clear and unambiguous prohibitions on unknowingly financing operations such as the examples I gave. And then also that the financing projects in conflict zones have yet to be included in the AIIB's exclusion list.
Yes, Mr. President. In the exclusion list, included in the list of projects the bank does not knowingly finance due to its damaging social environmental effects, there is forced labor or harmful or exploitative forms of child labor. I heard that the good senator mentioned forced labor, and there,
Yes, Madam
there
Sponsor.
is such provision in the exclusion list. It also says here, the production of or trade in any product or activity deemed illegal under national laws or regulations of the country in which the project is located, or international conventions and agreements or subject to international phase-out or bans, such as production or trade in products containing PCBs, pharmaceutical, pesticides, herbicides, other hazardous substances, subject to international phase-out or bans, covered by the Rotterdam Convention, Stockholm Convention, production, trade of ozone-depleting substances, in short, Montreal Protocol, etc., very recently done. So I can go on and on. Trade in wildlife. It's actually very, very strict. Transboundary movement of waste prohibited under the Basel Convention. Production of trade in weapons and munitions, including paramilitary materials. Production of trade in tobacco, etc. So even production of trade in of unbonded asbestos fibers. So there are also activities prohibited by legislation of the country in which the project is located or based. Therefore, they will respect the conventions, treaties, agreements, and national and local legislation of the Philippines.
I will review my own research, Madam Sponsor, but I would be glad to stand corrected if indeed, as explicitly mentioned by the Madam Sponsor, forced labor, child labor are already included in the AIIB
I can even furnish,
exclusion list.
yes, I can even
Madam
furnish the
Sponsor.
good senator a copy
Thank you,
of
Madam
all of
Sponsor.
these lists, which is actually, I am happy to note that it's very detailed and it covers much, if not all, of your concerns.
Thank you, Madam Sponsor. I'll also look into whether the concern I raised about radioactive materials is already covered by what the Madam Sponsor mentioned about hazardous substances, waste under the Basel Convention, and arms.
Yes, let me answer that. Because we already have existing national legislation and conventions, and therefore that is included when we say it would be deemed illegal under national laws or regulations of the country, and that they would abide by international conventions and agreements.
Thank you, Madam Sponsor. And then I just have that abiding concern about financing projects in conflict zones, not yet included in the AIIB exclusion list. To return, Madam Sponsor, to an earlier follow-up question on indigenous peoples. There must be a clear mention of the human rights of indigenous peoples as embodied and agreed by nations in the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, which is championed as well here in the Philippine Senate by Madam Sponsor. Furthermore, the concept of free, prior, and informed consent, or FPIC, in the AIIB AOA is narrowly defined. It invalidates collective consensus and unanimous FPIC by hinting towards disagreements within the IP communities in order to still validate individual FPICs to represent the consent of the community. This is a clear manipulation of the usage of FPIC and needs to be redrafted, Madam Sponsor.
Mr. President, because we have the IPRA law, which is already very, very strict. In fact, many of our developers, business community, etc., have complained about the strictness of the IPRA law, which requires free, prior, and informed consent. And clearly, in the guidelines of the treaty that we are concurring in today, we see that it would respect national legislation. And so the IPRA would be upheld. And that, I am certain, would cover the concern of the good senator.
Thank you, Madam Sponsor. I will look into how I might possibly suggest how the IPRA law can be more explicitly reflected in the AOA, or yes, in the AOA. To another question, Madam Sponsor, on the absence of a compliance review mechanism. The AOA does not clearly provide any provisions for the establishment of a specific compliance review mechanism which can investigate operations, management, and project sites. As of now, it does not provide a grievance mechanism for affected communities of AIIB projects. Responsibility for the implementation of the ESF may be passed on to financing consultants, which has been arguably a failed practice to implement safeguards both at the ADB and the World Bank. So something on which the AIIB has to be different if it really wants to be a different kind of bank. Client performance in the AOA is solely measured against obligations set forth in the legal agreement instead of against all safeguards.
Okay.
The draft ESF states that all environmental and social documents are required before the approval of the operation. However, the draft ESF then goes on to state in paragraphs 37 and 58 that resettlement action plans and other important requirements, such as plans for impacts on indigenous peoples, which we have discussed earlier, may also be developed subsequent to board approval. So there's widespread use of deferred compliance, which defeats the process of requiring protective measures prior to implementation. So in regard to that, Madam Sponsor, where is the commitment to, quote-unquote, do no harm in the ESF? The ESF objectives aim at managing operational and reputational risks of AIIB and to address, identify, or manage environmental and social risks and impacts, but falls short of a commitment to do no harm as an objective of the ESF.
First, Mr. President, to address the concern of the good senator on the grievance mechanism, there's actually a provision on the grievance mechanism. Establish a culturally appropriate and gender-inclusive grievance mechanism to receive and facilitate resolution of affected indigenous peoples' concerns and grievances. It goes on this provision and grievance mechanism. You'll also be happy to note that there is a free, prior, and informed consultation requirement of indigenous people. Again, a lengthy paragraph on that. There's also the commercial development of cultural resources, if it includes the commercial development of IP, cultural resources, and knowledge where they are protected as well. So all these concerns are actually covered here in this very thick book, which includes the guidelines to the treaty.
I will look further into those, good sponsor. Thank you for that. Regarding gender-appropriate grievance mechanisms, my next question is, in fact, on gender and labor issues. There's no clear guideline or safeguards on land ownership and gender-based access to customary rights over natural resources, and safeguarding against gender discrimination and violence per UN Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women, or UN CEDAW. The current draft does not require gender-segregated information and data on impacts and risk analysis. This makes project impacts on affected communities not accurately identified. And the AIIB does not clearly cite or require adherence to International Labor Organization's core labor standards at all levels of operation.
Yes. I'm glad that you mentioned the UN CEDAW, because we are a signatory to the UN CEDAW, just like we are a signatory to the UN Declaration on the Rights of the Indigenous People. As I mentioned earlier, it is indicated here that it will adhere and respect and recognizes our agreements and treaties and conventions to which we are a member of or a signatory to, as well as respect the law of the land.
I will look further into those, Madam Sponsor. To my second to the last question, on the non-resident Board of Directors. Unlike the ADB and the World Bank, where the boards of directors are resident, the AIIB is currently structured with a non-resident BOD. With a resident BOD, there is direct access with operations and management departments. This allows civil society to directly engage the BOD and raise complaints, share ground realities, and demand actions and change from operations and management. In case of the AIIB AOA on the issues of accountability and transparency, for now, it's vested in a non-resident board of directors. We can envision a very opaque bank which will not be held regularly accountable and therefore lead AIIB operations and management to remain far from any direct questioning.
Yes, Mr. President, that is a setup. Unlike the World Bank that you mentioned and the ADB, there's a resident. This is the members of the board don't have to be based in China.
But because this is designed to be lean, clean, and clean.
Because in this era of technology, high technology, through emails and internet and Skype and teleconference, I think that because the bank aims to be lean, clean, and green, and while the presence of the board of directors may be required at several times during the year for the board meetings, but it is not a requirement, and the board members can live in their areas of residence, but it does not mean that they will be remiss in their duties, and their core principles of being lean, clean, and green, as well as the core principles of transparency, independence, openness, and accountability will be upheld.
Thank you, Madam Sponsor. I'll look further into those responses. To my last main question, immunity from judicial proceedings. Similar to the ADB, the AIIB through Article 46.1 is immune from judicial proceedings. So if it wants to be different from the Asian Development Bank, on this point, it is not any different. Articles 47 to 50 further broaden the immunity from judiciary proceedings to all AIIB staff and operations. As a result, a binding grievance mechanism within the AIIB in case of project impacts has yet to be established. The AIIB should, in my humble opinion, Madam Sponsor, should include a requirement, for instance, in the projected loan agreement, that project management clients inform affected people of the existence of the mechanism and its functions. And just as an addition to this question, Madam Sponsor, no, it's okay. This is a separate last question, Madam Sponsor. So just on that issue of immunity from judicial proceedings.
Yes, we take note of that.
Thank you, Madam Sponsor. I'll follow up, Madam Sponsor, about this issue in a later stage, or is there a response forthcoming now?
Exceeding the immunity and judicial proceedings, exceeding the ADB and World Bank.
Yes, yes. You're correct in saying when the issue on, or the provision on immunity from judicial proceedings is similar to the ADB and the World Bank. Actually, it is entirely the same as the provision of the ADB and
Yes.
partially the same with the World Bank. And you've read that into the record. Yes, there is not much of a difference from that immunity clause.
Which would really disprove AIIB's claim to be different from these two other international financial institutions on this concern of immunity from judicial proceedings. So
It may
would-
be similar, Mr. President, on the
Yes.
immunity from the judicial proceedings, but in terms of the operations, it would be entirely different. The membership itself and many other aspects of the bank. So it may be similar insofar as a judicial proceedings provision is concerned.
I'm open, Madam Sponsor, to further studying how different AIIB operations would be from those of the World Bank and Asian Development Bank. But as we know, our recourse to judicial proceedings is one of the protections for a national community or local communities within a host nation, and especially when engaging with a large, powerful, highly resourced institution. So immunity still would remain a concern,
Yes.
Madam Sponsor.
We take note of that.
Thank you, Madam Sponsor. And to my last question, how can we ensure that the loans accessed through the AIIB are not tied? How is the AIIB better than the other international financial institutions like the World Bank, the International Monetary Fund, and the ADB, all the Bretton Woods institutions to which AIIB
Yes.
is presenting itself now as a real alternative?
Yes. In fact, that's one of the major differences. It is not tied, unlike the World Bank and the ADB, and in fact, they can even get contractors from other countries who are not members of the AIIB.
I'll further study that, Madam Sponsor.
That is a fact. They can get implementers of projects, contractors not coming from the members of the AIIB.
Of course, Madam Sponsor, the range of concrete meanings of not tied is not limited to being able to source implementers from just one country or another, but really but
It could be interpreted in various
practicing-
ways.
yes, Madam Sponsor,
But one of
especially- yes,
one of the
those.
major differences would be in the sense that they would not dictate who the contractors will be, and in fact, it could even be broadened to contractors not coming from the countries who are a member of the AIIB.
And another major difference, Madam Sponsor, and I would say more major, not to say major, but more major, would be that these loans would not be tied to unfair conditionalities, would not, that the AIIB would not subject us as a debtor to structural adjustments against the will of the government or its idea of the national interest. As my last point, Madam Sponsor, just some follow-up questions to our discussion this afternoon, which I would really appreciate comments on from Madam Sponsor, either today or in the next session. What are the mandatory and legally binding conditions whereby the AIIB assesses the equivalence of client systems with AIIB requirements in order to ensure that there is not an over-reliance on client self-assessment, self-monitoring, and self-reporting? What are the ambiguities or gaps in the text of the full AOA which fail to clearly indicate the possible impacts of bank operations on communities and the environment? Although this second follow-up question, Madam Sponsor, we already started to discuss. And what are the clear and mandatory accountability mechanisms which allow affected communities direct access to accountability, prevention, and redress of harms? Again, we have started to discuss this, but I will appreciate if there would be any further inputs from Madam Sponsor on these questions. Thank you very much, Mr. President, and thank you very much, Madam
Yes,
Sponsor.
and we will provide you the exclusion list, which I mentioned, and the matrix of the differences of ADB, World Bank, and the AIB, which is actually here. We can photocopy it for you, provide the office.
Thank you, Madam Sponsor.
I thank you for your interventions.
Mr. President, one more interpolator. May we recognize Senator Richard Gordon.
Senator Gordon is recognized for interpellation.
Thank you very much, Mr. President. Will the gentlelady yield to a few questions?
Yes, of course, Mr. President.
Mr. President, this is a landmark ratification we're doing here today. We're adding to the ADB, to the World Bank, and apparently, it seems to me that the major powers, the major players of the world today, including China, they're all trying to make a stab at controlling international financial institutions. Would you say, therefore, that this is a stab by China to make sure that they're able to control the world order as well, at least from the Asia-Pacific point of view?
What? Yeah. Well, the intent of this, Mr. President, is for China to provide financing to its, not only its neighbors, but to developing nations, vulnerable nations in dire need of infrastructure financing, Mr. President. So whether China is creating its own hegemony, as you say, that would be difficult for me to judge or to interpret as such.
But we do have to be alert on these matters, shouldn't we?
Of course, we should be alert. Mr.
After all,
President.
ADB is a Japanese lake, and the World Bank is a U.S. lake, so to speak. And now the Chinese, and isn't it rather obvious that the America and Japan are not joining AIIB?
They were both invited, ma'am.
Which really
were
shows that there
invited.
is a chasm and that there is geopolitics involved in this creation. Na talagang nakikita natin na talaga ang laro ay talagang makakuha ng influence ang mga bansa na yan.
Yes, it could be interpreted or viewed as that, Mr. President.
So we're all agreed here na influence ang pinaglalabanan dito ng malalaking bansa na tayo maliliit na mga biya ay talagang sumasakay lang dahil baka score tayo sa mababang interest rate na pinapakawil sa atin.
It could be interpreted as that, Mr. President. However, if it's
No, I would like to
profitable-
get the view of the government here because they are in possession of information that we do not have. Dapat sinasabi nila sa atin ang kanilang basa. Eh, syempre, kung ito hindi naman ito politika ng Pilipinas na kailangan nakapwesto tayo na nakakalapit tayo, nakakapagpalitrato tayo sa malalaking politiko para masabi natin ay tayo ay nakakabit sa kanilang ilalim ng kanilang payong. So, kasi halata ito eh. Halimbawa, nakikita natin na hindi nga sumali ang Japan, hindi sumali ang Amerika. Ang sumali yung mga ibang bansa katulad na sa G7, Canada, France, yung mga ganyan,
Canada is
na may interpret na bawat bayan na yan, ang tinitingnan nila yung interest national nila. So, hindi naman trick question ito eh. Is it in our interest, our national interest, ang tinatanong ko, nasasali tayo, in effect, knowing that the major powers are playing around with us?
Mr. President, it is to our national interest that we join because we can access funding at lower rates than the other multilateral lending institutions.
You're familiar with the phrase, he who pays the piper plays the tune.
Yes, Mr. President.
That unequal treaties are the result of unequal bargaining strength.
Yes.
Yeah.
No, what is the question, Mr. President?
Well, the question has been made. You're familiar with that phrase, and
Yes, I'm listening.
and
Yes,
I'm
Mr.
laying the
President.
predicate for my question. And having said that,
Are we playing to their tune?
in effect, eventually we will play to that tune. We're already playing to the tune of China right now. They're willing to give us machine guns or guns that buy one take three. Sabi ni President Duterte. Nakakatakot na tayo na.
Yeah. Yes, Mr. President.
In other words, papalawitan ka ng mura, tapos pag natali ka na, hindi ka na makakawala. Eh, hindi ba ganyan rin accusation natin sa mga Amerikano? Ang maganda lang dito ay talagang we're getting more choices, di ba?
It is to our interest, Mr. President, that we join because we can have access to funds which are not tied and the interest rate is lower than the other lending institutions. At the same time, there are countries ahead of us who have already accessed it. A country as small as Maldives and a country like Pakistan, they've accessed it for their infrastructure projects. So I believe this is, it is to our interest that we're able to access financing from another institution apart from the two big banks.
Without insulting these small countries, certainly they can decide on their own what is in their national interest. No? Pero yan lang makikita na talagang, halimbawa, tinatagalog ko para mapakinggan tayo ng mga tao at maintindihan nila. Halimbawa, pwede naman natin sabihin na kung ang bayan natin ay sumali dyan, makakautang nga tayo. On the other hand, pwede rin naman bumalikwas doon sa kabilaya, sabihin ng mga Amerikano, dyan na lang kayo, huwag na kayong utang sa amin. Mas mahihirapan kayo umutang sa amin. Is that a possibility?
I'm not certain
Or
that...
Japan? Sa ADB?
I'm not certain that if we borrow from the AIIB, the ADB or the World Bank will no longer support us or lend us. I cannot project that, Mr. President.
Gusto ko lang magkaroon ng assurance sa discussion, sa debate na tinalakay natin yan. Para sa ganun, ang Senado hindi naman natutulog at hindi natin tinitignan yung mga maaaring maging maraming suutan itong issue na ito. No?
Just to clarify that, Mr. President, in fact, the AIIB may even do co-financing with ADB and with World Bank.
Of course, that is within the realm of possibility. Kung saan makakakuha na mas magaling na bargain, ay gagawin nila yan. Pero, saan ba ang situs nitong bangko na ito? Sa Beijing?
In Beijing. Just in your previous question, there have been co-financing projects in other countries that have been members already with ADB, AIIB, and the World Bank.
Well, wala pa. Napapautang na bang AIB? Wala pa naman
Yes. Yes, Mr. President, because we're the 57th member. But there have been other countries, as I mentioned, like Maldives has accessed it, Pakistan has accessed it. There's a list of countries that have accessed it already. Bangladesh for $165 million, Indonesia. There's been a co-financing with ADB and the UK's Department of International Development. There is a project in Tajikistan, which is co-financed with the European Bank. And there's a project in Myanmar, which is co-financed with the IFC. There's a Pakistan project, which is co-financed with the World Bank.
Well, maganda yung balita yan dahil nakikita ko para yung maliliit na bansa na nangangailangan katulad ng Bangladesh, katulad ng Tajikistan, katulad ng Maldives na mas maliit pa sa bansa natin. Siyempre, that also inevitably buys influence for China. Tama? Is that correct, ma'am?
Possibly,
I'm sorry for
Mr.
my
President.
previous one. Is that correct, ma'am?
That is a possibility, Mr. President.
What is the voting share of China compared with other countries? Like India.
China's
Like Russia.
present voting power is 26%.
And against India, it's 7.51%. Against Russia, 5.92%.
Yes.
Germany, 4.15%. South Korea, 3.50%. Australia, 3.46%. And the Philippines' voting share is
1.1.
1.1%.
1.1%.
So, kaparenggot talaga. Depende.
We're number 20 out of the 57 founding members, Mr. President.
Yes. Now, supposing magkaroon ng Trans-Pacific Partnership, hindi pa naman sarado yun, di ba?
I'm not sure.
Hindi pa,
Yes.
hindi pa sarado yun.
I just
Bagamat
know-
sinabi ni...
I'm not very familiar with the TPP, but all I know is
don't
what
you
I
think we
read.
should be familiar with that
No,
as a country?
I'm not an expert on the TPP, but what I know is that the newly elected president who will sit in January of the United States is not in favor of the TPP.
Yes,
That's all I can
was
say.
about to say that. But I would imagine the government is all too aware of that. But then Trump, like our current president, has also changed his mind many times, hasn't he?
I don't know the president's position on TPP. I do not know, and I cannot project the changing of the mind of the U.S. president on the TPP.
All
Mr.
I'm
President.
saying is presidents do change their mind.
People change their minds.
Yes, but especially in the case of presidents, they should be consistent, they should be transparent, all their positions should be well thought out, So, hindi parang goma yung kanilang posisyon na magbabago. And all I'm saying is simply, I'm not being sarcastic here. All I'm saying is, we cannot be subject to the winds of mind changing by presidents. For example, if Trump suddenly changes his mind and says we'll pursue TPP because he's gotten hold, most people when they become president, they change their minds. Yung mga tinitira nila ng araw sa kanilang halalan, nagbabago ng isip, no? Even Hillary Clinton conceded, now he wants a recount. She wants a recount, which is triggering a counter response from Mr. Trump. And Mr. Trump has changed his mind on many other things. And that is the prerogative of the president, but it should not be used, it should be used sparingly. So my point is, what about TPP? What does the Philippine officialdom
What's the DFA
say about
position?
TPP? Meron pa bang pag-asa yun? O kung magbubukas ba yun, sasali ba tayo ron? Sasalihan natin lahat, siguro lahat yan.
Yes, Mr. President, I am told that, well, again, based on the DFA and the DOF, we are interested. It's a DTI that's a lead, no? This has been discussed.
In fact,
in some-
DTI said
The DTI,
it is in a strategic interest to join
we are,
TPP. Did they not?
the official Philippine government position is that the Philippines is interested in joining the TPP, but there is not, there is no specific move to join.
And supposing we do
They're
join,
in a period of study.
and supposing we do join, di ba, magkakaroon rin tayo ng investment dyan. Is that correct?
Yes, of course,
And
Mr.
in this
President.
particular instance, I heard the gentle lady say that in questions by Senator Drilon, sabi niya, ang sabi ng gentle lady ay makukuha natin yan from the President's budget of about 3 billion, 3%?
Our subscription,
Your subscription,
yes. The contingent fund,
Ah.
that, the savings of DOF and the contingent fund, Mr. President, only for the 2016, but the 2017 is already in the General Appropriations
I'm
Act.
aware of that because I was going, Senator Drilon, as usual, is very prescient from his years of experience, knew that it should have been in the budget. It's his birthday. I have to give him some, this is a long-time friendship. Allows us some liberties in pulling each other's ear once in a while. So which means that if we join TPP, there will still be savings from the President's budget. Contingent fund na may papasok natin sa
If
TPP.
we join AIIB, you mean, Mr. President?
No. Already we have joined AIIB. You already, the gentle lady already answered
until
na
we
meron.
until we concur in the ratification, our joining is not
And what
complete.
stage of development is that in? Are there negotiations to that effect until now?
Are you referring to AIIB or
TPP,
TPP?
TPP.
No, I answered you. I will repeat. It is in the period of study. There is no specific, we have not, there's no formal move. Any specific formal move to join the Trans-Pacific Partnership.
Well, that's why I'm a little bit confused because the Department of Trade said it is to our interest.
Mr. President, because the TPP has not even been ratified by the United States, so it cannot enter into force. And so the Philippine government is still studying its position, but the position of the Philippine government is that it is interested.
I think I'm aware of the position of the United States. I just want to be sure what our position is as a country. When the cabinet
It's
member
being studied.
of the DTI says they are in favor, is that correct?
Yes, Mr. President, they are in favor. It is undergoing study.
They're in favor, but the rest of the government is still studying it, yun ba?
The lead agency is the Department of Trade, and the
So-
Department of Foreign Affairs and the DOF would be part of the, they have been consulting, the DTI has been consulting the government departments for this study.
So if the lead agency, the Department of Trade, says it is good for us, tutulong yung DFA at saka yung finance.
DOF, yes.
DOF, di ba? So that means meron tayong more or less, we know where the winds are going.
Yes,
So
Mr.
in,
President.
let's say Trump changes his mind and says, okay, we'll go ahead Of course, hindi naman tayo sumusunod kay Trump lamang, pero kung gagawin yon at gusto natin makalamang ng konti, makadagdag doon sa influence natin, para ka sali na sali ka sa Rotary Club, sali ka sa JCs, sali ka sa Lions, ganun ba yun? I'm not being frivolous, I'm just stating a fact, because as you say, we can borrow here, we can borrow there, we can borrow everywhere.
We can borrow, Mr. President. It's to our best interest if the rates are good, if the conditions are...
Oh, definitely.
Yeah.
I don't think we're talking about judgment. We're talking about access to
And
credit.
so, the question,
So,
Mr.
is it to our
President,
interest that we have access to credit, to
Yes,
TPP?
yes.
Yun lang naman tinatanong ko eh.
Yes,
There's
Mr.
no trick
President.
questions here.
The answer is in the affirmative. The government, led by the DTI, and consultations are ongoing with both the DOF and the DFA. But the answer, yes, we are interested, and in the event it would enter into force, then at least we will be ready after having thoroughly studied it.
And of course, the TPP, China will not be included.
China is not included.
It's not included. They're
It's
not included.
Not invited, yes, and not included, of course.
They're not included. That's right. Now, the only reason why I'm asking those preliminary questions earlier is if China is good today, they can be bad tomorrow. If the United States is good today, they can be bad tomorrow. They were allies earlier on. Sa umpisa, marami namatay dun sa Buddajo. Tapos sa World War II, kasama natin, inose tayo dun sa decision, agreement, tapos nakabawi ng konti. Ganon naman dito sa China ngayon. Galit ang presidente ng konti sa Amerikano, hindi lang konti, malaki. Ngayon, sinasabi niya, dapat ipipivot natin. And this is consistent with the policy. And I kind of agree with that. Na laruin natin ang China, laruin natin ang Russia, laruin natin ang Amerika. Ang sinasabi ko lang, today, as I was watching TV, nakita ko yung sa ilalim, pinapalayas na naman ng barko ng China yung mga fishermen natin. Are we aware of that? Sa Panatag Shoals. Is the young lady aware of that?
That's only today, no. I've not heard about it. It's probably...
Well, I'd like to put it on record that ABS-CBN, the station that where I see you when you were younger, you know, saying that there were so many things that that have happened with the world tonight, and I keep seeing you there, resplendent and beautiful and radiant and young and vibrant, you know. Yung station na yon, sinabi kanina,
Yes, Mr. President.
na ang Panatag Shoal, pinapaalis na naman yung...
I don't have first-hand information, Mr. President.
Well,
but if-
I'm just saying, in the same manner, I will take the gentle lady's word for it. Kind of take my word for it because I saw it and I was
Yes,
a bit upset.
correct.
I was a bit upset.
The DFA says that they're trying to validate the information from the Coast Guard. Yes, you've seen it in the news. The news must be correct 99.9% of the time. Now, there is no official DFA statement on the alleged shooing away of our fisher folks in Panatag.
The questions that are being framed here, and I don't have to be defensive about it, is to make sure that we are completely aware
Of what we're
of our
getting into.
responsibilities to our country in terms of the national interest. That there are no permanent friends, which is an old adage which I
Understood.
think
That is
every student of foreign affairs knows. There are only permanent interests. And
You're
so,
very correct.
And so if that is the case, and that is an adage from one of the biggest imperialist nations, the foreign minister, I believe, or their prime minister once said that. And I just want to make sure that if we do join this, it will help leverage us indeed, but hopefully in other parts, especially with such a huge amount. Sa ADB ba, is the gentle lady aware,
Magkano
ilan ang
ang ADB?
share ng Japan?
What is Japan?
And at least they're here, they're not in
Yeah,
Tokyo.
in ADB.
The situs of the ADB is here. In fact, the former department, the former ADB building is now occupied by the DFA as its headquarters.
Oo.
And they moved into near Ortigas para mas maganda yung kanilang building.
Shares ng Japan sa ADB, you have it?
Pero ito sa China gagawin, sa Beijing.
This is Beijing. Mr. President, we don't have the exact shares of Japan in the ADB now. If we could just be submitting it to you when they have it.
Yeah, can you do that? Because
Yeah.
if something like this as important as is being presented, I think we should compare notes, compare positions. It would only be fair for the Senate to know what positions there
I
were.
have it now, Mr. President.
Pala eh.
It's 15.6%.
So Tokyo is
ADB.
15%.
15.6%.
And China is, ilan dito? 26%?
Here, 21. What is China? Let me see. China's 26%.
26%.
In the AIB and ADB, I just mentioned it, Japan's share.
And in the World
16,
Bank, the US is how much?
And the US and the World Bank.
You get from the breakdown to the, it's in the website.
The voting share.
US World Bank is 15%.
So 15%
So
US
15%
World
sa
Bank,
World Bank ang US, 15%
26.
ang Japan sa ADB,
And
pero
26%
dito
for
sa
AIIB.
China, dito where China controls, it's 26%.
Yes, Mr. President.
Doesn't that give us some pause to think about it? We're going to sign it. I'm supporting this. I just want to be sure that there was a lot of gray matter put into this.
I see what you're
I'm
trying
sure
to
that was
say.
co- that
I
was
see
put
what
into
you're trying to
consideration,
say.
right? In other words, pagka magalit siya in China, baka di ka makautang. Kung masaya ka, and supposing you want to take out your money, madali bang i-take out yung pera dyan?
Yes.
How
Yes,
would
Mr.
you do that? What
President.
would be the process?
There's a mechanism for pull-out.
I'm sure.
And I read that earlier into the record. We can actually pull out. It has to go through the process as within the ratification, but in terms of our investment, it will be given back to us at the purchase value. No, at the value at the time
At the
of
current value.
withdrawal.
Because ADB will maybe
At the time of pull out, right?
Japan, but
It has to be. Lugi tayo. Pagka pull out ka, tapos bibigay sa'yo yung pinasok mong value
No.
10 years ago or 20 years
It
ago.
will be the value at the time of the withdrawal. If
At the
we
time of the
pull out.
withdrawal.
In terms of the veto power, you were asking, China has no veto power. That's a difference in AIIB, while Japan has veto power over ADB, and the US has veto power in the World Bank.
Well, sometimes you don't even have to exercise veto power. All you have to do is exercise a little bit of influence. A little sneeze here, a little frown there,
Yeah,
could
ju-
go a
just-
lot of ways. And
Yeah.
I know that for a fact.
Well, just to address that concern, Mr. President, and that's one of the differences between or among the AIIB, the World Bank, and the ADB, despite China's major influence within AIIB having 26% of the total voting powers, the bank is a multilateral institution owned by 57 member countries. As such, it would be difficult for China to exercise full control of AIIB's direction and operations.
But most definitely, when one wants to borrow money, you have to curry favor with the Chinese. And probably the president of this bank will be Chinese.
Yes, Mr. President,
All I'm saying is let's be realistic.
of
All
course.
right? I have no illusions about this.
It's their bank, they'll run it. Yeah.
It's not their bank, but
mean, it's
they will claim that,
majority.
you know, they're there, they have, they started it, they put it in their capital, and they have 26%, and that should be an awful lot of negotiating power.
This is the voting power.
World Bank of Japan, US, Japan.
In terms of percentage in voting power, the US and the World Bank has 16.51% voting power, Japan 7.14% voting power in the World Bank, and China 4.61% voting power in the World Bank. In the World Bank,
Yeah, that's correct.
Getting the ADB.
yes.
Well, Bretton Woods yan lahat siya, di ba? So, and that's why how America controls the world. It opens its borders to free trade. It created all these institutions where people can borrow money. And now China is trying to adopt that kind of an attitude. Would you say that's correct? that kind of a strategy as well?
I always agree with what you say.
I'm sorry?
I agree with you, Mr. President.
The agreement of the gentle lady is good, but her credit is way smaller than the agreement of the people behind her,
Is this the
which is the
voting
Philippine
power?
government.
Shareholdings in ADB. Just to put on record, Mr. President, the shareholdings in ADB, Japan 15.6%, the US 15.5%, and China 6.5%.
Yeah, so it's, I can always ask the other side of the question, and that is why China is now putting up their own
Their
bank.
own.
It's natural.
It's
It's a
fair.
sense of preserving not just their power, but their influence. There's no doubt that influence will be wielded here. All right?
Yes,
So,
Mr. President.
okay, so that-
It's to their interest. It's also part of economic diplomacy. in a way.
Definitely. Definitely. I just wanted to ask these questions because I know the gentle lady would be able to answer all these questions. Thank you
Not
very
all.
much.
Thank you, Mr. President.
Mr. President, I move to close the period of interpellation.
There is a motion to close the period of interpolation. Any objection? Chair is none. Period of interpolation is hereby closed.
Move to open the period of committee amendments, Mr. President.
Rachel,
Motion to open the period of committee
mabilis.
amendments.
Parang paborito ko si Carl Chua. Ayan.
There being no objection, period for committee amendments is hereby
Not the treaty,
open.
the resolution.
Senator Legarda is recognized for any committee amendments.
No, we don't amend. We
Diba?
don't amend this.
If there are no committee amendments,
There's no committee individual.
Mr. President, I move to close the period of committee amendments.
An
We don't
objection?
amend the treaty.
Period for committee amendments is hereby terminated.
Yes, you vote
Move
first.
to open the period of individual amendments, Mr. President.
Any objection? There being none, motion is approved.
Move to recognize Senator Drilon to propose an individual amendment to the resolution adopting the agreement, Mr. President.
Senators Legarda and Drilon are recognized for the period of individual
Second
amendments.
reading. Monday na third. Sabi, sige.
Bakit may end?
Thank you, thank you.
Walang andyan. Okay, yun na ba? Okay na. Yes. Mr. President, we
Nakakalata na ako dito.
Mr. President, may
Yes,
we
Mr. President.
submit for the consideration
May I hear the individual amendment, Mr. President?
of the sponsor the following amendments. Just as a matter of style, on the first whereas clause, we propose that the first whereas clause will read as follows. Whereas Article 7, Roman numerals, Section 21 of the Philippine Constitution provides that, colon, and then the rest of the sentence states. I repeat, whereas Article 7, Section 21 of the Constitution provides that, colon.
Can I have a copy? Saan? Okay. Yes, I accept, Mr. President.
Any objection? There being none, the amendment is hereby approved.
The sixth whereas clause,
Okay.
we propose to amend the same to read as follows. Whereas it's really difficult to have two Senate sessions, Mr. President. We should only have one. Whereas
Go ahead, sir.
President Benigno S. Aquino Jr. and President Rodrigo Roa Duterte ratified the agreement on 31 December 2015 and 19 October 2016 respectively.
Yes, accepted, Mr. President.
Benigno, I'm sorry, it's Benigno S. Aquino III, not Benigno.
Can we read the entire whereas, the new
Can I
whereas
read it?
proposed?
Whereas President Benigno S. Aquino III and President Rodrigo Roa Duterte ratified the agreement on 31 December 2015 and 19 October 2016 respectively, and delete the rest of the sentence.
Yes, Mr. President.
Any objection? Hearing none, the amendment is...
I'm sorry, let me, the date of ratification, the rate of ratification of President Aquino is February 24. February 4.
February 4, what year, ma'am?
December 31 was the signing, and the
All right, so we
ratification
stand corrected. It
is
should be
February
on
4,
February
2016.
4, 2016.
October 19, ang kay Duterte, ang ratification. Okay.
We have no problem with the other date.
October 19 is accurate.
So if we accept the amendment,
So the proposed amendment has been amended by correcting the date. Any objection? Hearing none, the amendment is approved.
after that, the 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. There should be a seventh whereas clause to read as follows, Mr. President. Whereas the agreement is submitted to the Senate for concurrence, comma, in accordance with the Constitution, semicolon.
Accepted, Mr. President.
Any objection to the new seventh whereas clause? Hearing none, the amendment is approved.
What is now the eighth whereas clause, we propose to amend to read as follows. Whereas in the hearing conducted by the Senate Committee on Foreign Relations on 10 November 2016, the Department of Foreign Affairs, Department of Finance, comma, Department of Budget and Management, comma, Department of Justice, comma, the National Economic Development Authority, and the Bangko Sentral ng Pilipinas favorably endorsed the concurrence of the Senate to the ratification of the agreement. It's part of the Department of Finance. We deleted the Bureau of Treasury and the
Bureau of Internal
Bureau
Revenue.
of Internal Revenue as they being part
Because-
of the Department of Finance. That's all.
What does the sponsor say?
Yes, accepted, Mr. President.
Any objection? Hearing none, the proposed amendment is approved.
Finally, add another resolutory clause to it. Resolved finally that the President of the Philippines may, comma, with the concurrence of 2/3 of all the members of the Senate, comma, withdraw from the membership, ano ito?
Amendment.
Withdraw
Okay.
the Philippines from membership,
Sino yung taga-DOF?
sorry, can I, huh? 1 minute suspension.
A minute suspension.
Homework. Ano yun?
Withdraw from the membership of the Philippines. Withdraw the membership.
Why? Yeah, that's why we're stating the rules for withdrawal. You're asking for a concurrence, we will tell you the terms of our concurrence.
Yeah, okay. In the concurrence of the Senate. Sige. Bahala na in the future.
Wala sila interpret yung bago Senado kung gusto nila.
Di ba?
We're ready to resume, Mr. President.
Session is resumed.
May we restate the amendment, Mr. President? We add a final and another resolutory clause to read as follows. Resolved finally that the President of the Philippines may, with the concurrence of the Senate, withdraw the membership of the Philippines from the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank.
Accepted.
Accepted. Any objection? Hearing none, the proposed amendment is approved.
We have no more amendment, Mr. President.
Thank you for your brilliant amendments, Mr. President.
Mr. President, I move to close the period of individual amendments.
Any objection? There being none, motion is approved.
Mr. President, I move that we adopt PS Resolution 241 under Committee Report Number 11
On second
on
reading,
second reading.
there is a motion to approve on second reading Senate Resolution number 241 under Committee Report number 11. Any objection? There being none, the motion is approved.
Mr. President, for the record, Senator Cayetano requests that his sponsorship speech be inserted into the records, Mr. President.
So the request is granted and noted.
Thank you, Mr. President. I move to suspend consideration of PS Resolution 241 under Committee Report Number 11.
There is a motion to suspend consideration of the measure. Any objection? There being none, the motion is approved.
With the permission of the body, Mr. President, I move to transfer from the calendar for ordinary business to the calendar for special orders. Senate Bill 1255 under Committee Report 12.
There's a motion to transfer from the current calendar for ordinary business to the calendar for special orders. Senate Bill number 1255 under Committee Report number 12. Any objection? There being none, the motion is approved.
With the permission of the body, I move to consider Senate Bill 1255 under the Committee Report Number 12.
Any objection? There being none, motion is approved.
May we ask Secretary to read the title of the measure, Mr. President?
Secretary.
An act expanding the coverage of exemptions from revealing the source of published news or information obtained in confidence by including journalists from broadcast news agencies and internet publications, amending for the purpose Section 1 of Republic Act 53 as amended by RA 1477.
Mr. President, to sponsor the measure, may we ask the Chairman of the Committee on Public Information and Mass Media, Senator Grace Poe, be recognized.
Senator Poe is recognized to sponsor the measure.
Mr. President, distinguished colleagues and guests, magandang hapon po. I'm here to sponsor Senate Bill number 1255, otherwise known as an act amending Republic Act number 53, better known as the SOTO Law or SHIELD Law. The committee report is a consolidation of two bills, Senate Bill number 6 and Senate Bill number 486, which were filed by Senators Soto and Trillanes, respectively. During our committee hearing on the proposed measure, all stakeholders from the media, government, and civil society organizations have agreed on one thing. This 70-year-old law is ripe for amending. RA 53 was first passed in 1946 upon the proposal of the late Senator Vicente Yap Soto, when the dissemination of news and investigative reports were mostly solely through print media. It exempts the publisher, editor, columnists, or duly accredited reporter of any newspaper, magazines, or periodical of general circulation from divulging their sources unless it endangers the security of the state. It is in consonance with Section 4 of the Constitution that safeguards the freedom of speech and expression. It enables press freedom and guarantees the freedom of speech by ensuring that the press is allowed to report on matters involving public interest without fear of undue pressure from the government to reveal their sources. It guarantees the safety of news sources who, if not for this law, would most likely cower at the thought of prosecution for revealing to the media what they know. 10 years later, RA 53 was amended to recognize the fact that press freedom is not absolute and falsity can and should be punished under civil and criminal laws. Thus, the addition of the caveat in the law that the publisher, editor, columnist, or duly accredited reporter of any print media may still be held liable under civil and criminal laws. The SHIELD law has also been carried over or reiterated in RA 10173 or the Data Privacy Act of 2012. Nonetheless, the language of the law is still confined to print media. Today, we want to expand the coverage of RA 53 to respond to growing technology. We now receive news not just through print media, but also through broadcast media such as TV, radio, and the internet. Based on a 2012 survey conducted by TNS, 45% of 1,000 respondents from classes A, B, C, D, and E claimed that they connect to the internet, while 36% listen to the radio, 12% read newspapers, and 4% read magazines. Given these figures, it appears that the preferred mode of accessing information is no longer through print media, obviously. Thus, under our proposed measure, we shall expand the coverage of RA 53 as amended to any publisher, owner, or duly recognized or accredited journalist, writer, reporter, contributor, opinion writer, editor, manager, producer, news director, webmaster, cartoonist, or media practitioner involved in the writing, editing, production, and dissemination of news for mass circulation of any print broadcast, wire service organization, or electronic mass media, including but not limited to the internet and cable TV and its variants. Perhaps some of you are wondering why include cartoonists or opinion writers or even webmasters. This is because if a person is involved in the creation, production, or dissemination of news reports, whether through words, actions, or pictures, then their sources should be afforded protection under the law. But what about libelous content? The SHIELD law cannot be used to protect a person from libel. We have retained the first part of RA 53 as amended, which states, and I quote, "without prejudice to his liability under the civil and criminal laws," end of quote. The law, therefore, protects media practitioners from being compelled or forced to reveal their sources, but not from spewing out malicious imputations under the guise of journalism. Are fake news sites covered by the SHIELD law? No. To a degree, there will be some sort of accreditation, which shall be affected by the media outlets and practitioners themselves. Besides, fake news sites usually aggregate content from legitimate news sites and distort the content to propagate information that will either fit their political agenda or spread misinformation. Thus, they usually have no sources to protect. The value of RA 53 should not be undermined. In several instances, this law had protected journalists from the legislation, in aid of legislation, in order to coerce resource persons, particularly those from the media, to divulge their sources, even if the information had nothing to do with the security of the state. For example, RA 53 was invoked when in 2007, the Senate Ethics Committee tried to compel a journalist from PDI or the Daily Inquirer to reveal her sources who exposed details of a closed-door hearing. Similarly, in 2015, the Shield Law was again invoked when a reporter of the Standard allegedly, based on her sources, the previous administration used money for a crime lord to guarantee the swift approval of the Bangsamoro Basic Law. As lawmakers, we should capacitate the Fourth Estate, the media, in ferreting out the truth. The media have a dangerous job, and one way we can help them is to ensure the protection of their sources. The Shield Law actually acts as a second shield, with the first line of defense being the media practitioners themselves. Through this law, we want to embolden whistleblowers to speak out. If they cannot approach government institutions, then they should at least be able to approach the media. It is about time we amend this law and extend protection to our truth seekers and tellers in broadcast and online media. Maraming salamat po.
Thank you, Senator Poe. Majority Leader?
Mr. President, I move for the approval. I'm joking, Mr. President.
This is a bill authored by the Majority Leader.
Yes, and my grandfather, Mr.
That
President.
explains his
So,
excitement.
give time to the other senators to study the proposed measure. I move to suspend consideration of Senate Bill 1255 under Committee Report Number 12, Mr. President.
Any objection to suspend consideration of Senate Bill number 1255? No objection. The motion is approved.
Thank you. Mr. President, with the consent of the body, as per prior agreement between concerned senators, I move that we elect Senator Sani Angara to replace Senator J.B. Ejercito in the Commission on Appointments.
There is a motion to elect Senator Angara as the replacement of Senator Ejercito in the Commission on Appointments. Any objection? Hearing none, the motion is approved, and Senator Angara is now part of the Senate delegation to the Commission on Appointments.
Mr. President, upon the request of Senator Hontiveros, with the consent of the body, and after conferring the matter with the concerned committee chairs, I move that we transfer the primary referral of Senate Bill 1250, a bill amending the sexual harassment law, and Senate Bill 1252, or the amendments to the anti-rape law, from the Committee on Labor and Employment and Committee on Justice and Human Rights, respectively, to the Committee on Women, Children, Gender Equality, and Family Relations. So Senate Bill 1250 and Senate Bill 1252 shall then be secondarily referred to the Committee on Labor and Employment, Committee on Justice and Human Rights. Wait, Mr. President. May I have a 1-minute suspension?
A minute suspension.
Yeah, thank you. We will ready to resume, Mr. President.
Session is resumed.
Let me restate my final motion, Mr. President. So, this becomes, the Senate Bill 1250 shall be secondarily referred to the Committee on Labor and Employment. And Senate Bill 1252 shall be secondarily referred to the Committee on Justice and Human Rights. I so move, Mr. President.
With both bills primarily referred to the Committee on
Women, yes.
There is a motion to transfer the primary referral of Senate Bill number 1250 to the Committee on Women, making the Labor Committee the secondary referral. Any objection? Hearing none, the motion is approved. There is
Thank
also
you.
another motion to refer Senate Bill number 1252 to change its primary referral now to the Committee on Women and make the Committee on Justice as a secondary referral. Any objection? There being none, the motion is approved.
Mr. President, I move that we adjourn the session until 3 o'clock in the afternoon of Monday, December 5, 2016.
Any objection? There being none, session is adjourned until 3 o'clock in the afternoon of Monday, December 5, 2016.